Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
It's hard to overstate the historic importance of Intel to the U.S. technology industry.
What lets you learn about the world in a whole new way? The Intel Pentium processor.
After it was founded in 1968, Intel pioneered the chips that made modern computing possible. And for decades, the company was one of the crown jewels of Silicon Valley.
The Intel Pentium processor.
But in the last decade, Intel has lost its technological lead and huge amounts of market share. At the start of 2020, Intel had a market cap close to $250 billion, more than twice that of NVIDIA. As of this week, Intel's cap was below $100 billion, and NVIDIA's was 38 times bigger. As Bloomberg's Ian King says, Intel is at a crossroads.
This is a company that I think is symbolic of so many things that are important to one country and one industry that suddenly just can't do it.
In December, Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger was forced out after a disastrous year.
Breaking news, Intel. The stock so far this year down by more than 50%. This headline will not be a surprise. Intel announcing the retirement of the CEO, Pat Gelsinger. The board has formed a search committee for his successor.
He had been considered by many to be Intel's best hope to get the company back to the pinnacle of the chip business. But now, some in the tech industry are asking, is Intel at risk of disappearing entirely? I'm David Gura, and this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. Today on the show, the rise and fall of Intel, with Bloomberg tech reporter Ian King, who's covered the company for decades. A clear-eyed look at the challenges Intel faces and what it would mean if Intel went away. Ian, what was the innovation that really made this company take off at the beginning?
Remarkably, for an important company that's been dominant for so long, they've actually had more than one life. They started off in computer memory. They saw that, hey, we need fast computer memory. So that was their first big breakthrough, and they really kind of revolutionized and made that, an industry. Then the PC came along, right, at the beginning of the 80s.
The IBM personal computer. Not only can it help you plan ahead, it'll balance your books and give you more time to make dough.
Intel was the brains of that PC. IBM chose an Intel part to be the new guts of this thing that was really going to change, basically, modern life in so many different ways. And Intel were there right at the beginning of that and saw this particular type of product, the microprocessor, was going to be a huge deal, and indeed it was.
As Intel grew, it maintained its advantage by being the best at making the semiconductor components on a computer chip smaller and smaller. Each one was a technological marvel that for decades left Intel's competitors scrambling to keep up.
Semiconductors are basically tiny electronic switches known as transistors. Those transistors are either on or they're off. It's either a 1 or a 0, and that is the basic unit of storage of information in the electronic world. The way that you put more transistors on a chip is to shrink the line widths on those transistors. Now, a modern NVIDIA chip has literally hundreds of billions of these transistors on something that's not much bigger than your thumbnail. And that is an incredible feat from where we started off when these guys started the company.
Ian says much of Intel's initial success came down to how its founders and early CEOs ran the company. People like Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, who started it, and Andy Grove, who eventually became its chief executive. They worked hard to develop a company culture that helped Intel maintain a formidable scientific and commercial lead.
Frankly, all of the structures that have come into being that determine how the industry and tech in general work largely stem from a lot of the observations, a lot of practices that these guys put in place all that time ago.
They were pathbreakers, pioneers. How did they corner the market so effectively? And after it took off and there was this kind of broader awareness that chips were going to be important, why was it so difficult for other companies to give Intel a run for its money?
Luck, design, and extremely hard work But I think fundamentally the understanding of volume economics and the understanding of the brutality of the industry, and that you have to make enormous bets. Right now, a chip plant costs $20 billion, probably more. You have to run that 24/7 because guess what? In 5 years, it's going to be obsolete, right? So there's a tremendous upfront capital cost. So one of the things that they understood was the economics. They also understood marketing.
That's the Pentium processor from Intel, the computer inside.
Intel Inside. Everybody knows what Intel Inside is. I mean, this is a component company, right, that made its brand one of the biggest in the world. They made consumers associate quality in computers not with Dell, not with HP, not with any other computer manufacturer, but with Intel, with the components that nobody ever saw.
So Intel had the best marketing, the best chip design, and the best manufacturing. But, as Ian says, it was a less tangible factor that kept Intel on top for its first few decades, the notorious discipline that Andy Grove put in place.
He established a culture in that company, the famous "only the paranoid survive," but lots of other things that he instilled were basically designed to keep Intel on the edge of its seat, to make sure they never got happy, fat and lazy. Things like constructive confrontation, the idea that if you're in a meeting, you hear something, doesn't matter who you are, you call it out if you think it's wrong. The idea that if you're a leader, you listen, right? You take action. He made people sign in at 8 a.m. every morning because he didn't want the semiconductor industry to be this happy-go-lucky science project. He wanted it to be a real business. So that kind of rigorous culture was definitely a conscious effort.
But at the same time that Intel was riding high, a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, was founded. Intel designs and manufactures its chips. TSMC made its big bet on manufacturing chips that other firms designed. Well, that model created an opportunity for companies like NVIDIA. They could design and sell their own chips and compete directly with Intel without having to invest in production.
TSMC created a new sector of the industry, one that Intel frankly laughed at publicly, and many others agreed with Intel, the idea that you could outsource the core amount of production, that the idea of decoupling completely the design process from the manufacturing process was possible and made sense. Intel laughed at that. TSMC said, no, this is the way of the future. And guess what? TSMC were right. And they have enabled many of Intel's erstwhile weakling competitors to be just as good as Intel, if not better.
When we come back, how Intel started to lose its competitive edge just as AI came onto the scene, and the hopes it placed in a new chief executive to turn things around. By the turn of the millennium, Intel was at the top of its game and an undisputed leader in the computing industry. The company dominated the chip market, both for PCs and data centers. But then, in the 2000s, its dominance started to slip. When Steve Jobs began to scout chips for the iPhone, he thought Intel's chips were too expensive. So those first orders went to a rival, Samsung. Then, in the 2010s, the technical momentum that Intel had built, its ability to make the components on its chips smaller and smaller, well, that started to falter, and it opened the door to competitors like NVIDIA.
Intel had promised that it was going to bring this, the next generation of its process technology in 2015, like clockwork, like we're going to be here, we're going to make that advance, and it didn't happen, right? It didn't happen. And then people were like, well, where is it? And there were lots of conference calls. Well, don't worry, it's coming. 2015 rolls past, this new technology doesn't emerge. 2019 comes along, and we still not got it. At this point, the numbers are still great. Intel's still making money hand over fist. But guess what? The next big thing is 4 years too late. This is not Intel. This is not who they are.
When it comes to AI, was Intel naive to what the demands would be for chips that could do the kind of computation that is necessary? Did they just fail to embrace it? Did they fail to understand the seriousness of it? Did they not see that that was the direction in which things were going? So what explains the edge that NVIDIA has today?
Intel had no excuse for not seeing this coming. So what happened, right? It's really hard and I think dangerous to place the blame or the root cause of any one massive issue like we have at the feet of one person. But guess what? A lot of people blame Brian Krzanich, the former CEO, for having created the situation that has led to the current impasse.
Let me tease that out a little bit more. So if that's the case that they're making, what is the direct criticism? What do they think that he failed to do?
Well, our reporting shows Krzanich comes in 2013 as supposedly the joint sort of leader of this company with a woman called Renee James, who was also a long-term Intel person. His pitch publicly was like, yeah, we're going to embrace all of these new markets. We're going to just run towards whatever we can and not be, snobs and dominant. What happened behind the scenes was he was banging his fist on the table, telling people that they were stupid people who were pointing out to him that, hey, we need to embrace this new kind of technology and manufacturing or else we're going to lose our edge. And a lot of the people that Intel had sort of brought up in this established management program that they have to create these strong leaders, not just at the very top, but across had left, had just said, I can't deal with this anymore, I'm out of here. So that, according to our reporting, is what went wrong, and that is what led to the situation that they are in now.
In 2021, Intel hires Pat Gelsinger to turn the company around. Tell us a bit about who he was and why he was an attractive candidate to run the company.
There is nobody more Intel than Pat Gelsinger was and still is. He was a personal acolyte of Andy Grove. He joined the company as a teenager, went to technical college, then went to university to get the kind of degrees that were necessary for Intel, for working at Intel. Started off in kind of low-level engineering jobs and worked his way up. He was the first ever CTO at Intel. He was the kind of point person for all of their presentations. He was the evangelist for their technology. He loved Intel. Then it got to the 2010s, and part of the decision-making process for who was going to lead the company, according to Pat Gelsinger, he went to the then chairman, Andy Bryant, and said, hey, have I got a shot here? Got told, no, you don't, and took his business elsewhere, became the CEO of VMware. Fast forward to 2021, when by this point, the finances are starting to creak. The products aren't flying off the shelves anymore. The company needs somebody who's going to come back and embrace its culture and revitalize it and be on the mountaintop saying we need to be back to the old Intel. And, he's the ideal person, and they brought him back then.
When did it become clear that the board and investors were growing impatient with him and his plan for turning it around?
I mean, there are a couple of ways to look at this. It takes a year, maybe more, to design a chip, to bring it to market, to get it through the manufacturing process. I mean, the finances were clearly getting worse. Intel became a loss-making company. To his credit, he said this was going to happen. People just didn't listen. Right? He said it was going to take 5 years. They didn't give him 5 years. Right? He said leadership won't come easy. It'll be expensive. It'll cost us a lot of money. And so there became a situation where there was a disconnect, where they felt that he'd lost kind of touch with the reality of the moment, that maybe the message he was selling wasn't connected to the reality that Wall Street was seeing. Maybe the message he was selling was necessary internally to rally the troops. Maybe it was necessary for Washington to rally the government behind his efforts for the CHIPS Act and give him money. But that wasn't the right message for Wall Street. And that was where the disconnect came in, and obviously the share price went through some disastrous one-day performances, which is very difficult for a board to sit there and look at.
You mentioned the CHIPS Act. This was legislation passed to sort of ensure that the U.S. would always have access to semiconductors, and I know that Intel has benefited from some of that money, from some of that funding. How helpful has it been to Intel's fortunes?
It hasn't yet. It's a lot of money for you and me, but it's not even half the price of one factory, right? The way to look at it is that it makes the costs of building factories, of building leading-edge facilities in the United States comparable to building them in, say, South Korea or Taiwan or China, for that matter. It's basically reducing the costs of setup. It's not paying for anything. So far, it's helped Intel a little bit, but not really.
Then, at the end of last year, Pat Gelsinger resigned. Bloomberg reported that Intel's board told Gelsinger he was being replaced, and Gelsinger decided to step down immediately. The company is currently being led by 2 interim CEOs, while Intel tries to find a replacement. On their fourth quarter earnings call at the end of January, Michelle Johnston Holthouse, one of those two interim co-chiefs, said there were no quick fixes, that they were dedicated to rebuilding Intel's credibility and making the company's business simpler and leaner, while the search for a permanent CEO continues.
What we can say from the outside is that who they put in place, the type of person that they choose, will really tell us almost instantly what the board has in mind for the future of Intel. And the biggest, I think, question mark there is whether Intel actually continues as Intel, whether it is still this company that designs and manufactures chips, that sells chips, and also operates this massive factory network. Right now, Wall Street and the bankers are betting that that will not be the case, that the company will be split up.
Just wrapping up here, is there a real risk today that Intel, as we know it, as we have known it, could disappear?
You have to say that there is absolutely a risk that Intel, as we know it, will cease to exist, that might not be here at the end of the year.
So we should see that, if it happens, as much more than just a symbolic loss.
It'll be hard to see it as anything other than an enormous blow to national prestige, to the capabilities that this country has to lead a crucial industry. And there'll be lots of questions about who will carry that torch going forward. This is a company that I think is symbolic of so many things that are important to one country and one industry that suddenly just can't do it. I've spoken to some of Intel's bitterest enemies, to executives at companies who've suffered for years at the hands of Intel, have frankly hated Intel, who say openly, we cannot as an industry afford to have Intel fail. We need to have Intel back. And it's been remarkable to see that.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm David Gura. This episode is produced by Alex Ty. It was edited by Aaron Edwards, Patty Hirsch, and Jillian Ward. It was fact-checked by Adriana Tapia and mixed and sound designed by Alex Segura. Our senior producer is Naomi Shavin. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Our executive producer is Nicole Beamsterboer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.